My name is Claire Morgan, and I have spent the last 15 years of my life standing in the shadows of the most expensive rooms in the world. I am 42 years old, and my official title is Event Compliance Officer. If you've ever attended a multi-million-dollar charity gala, a celebrity wedding, or a massive corporate summit, you have probably never noticed someone like me. My job is not glamorous. I don't pick out the floral arrangements, I don't taste the champagne, and I don't pose for photographs on the red carpet. My job is the paperwork. I am the person who calculates the exact maximum occupancy of a ballroom down to the square inch. I am the person who ensures the temporary liquor license aligns perfectly with the municipal fire code. I review the insurance riders, verify the vendor certifications, and make sure the massive, multi-tiered staging equipment isn't blocking a critical emergency exit. In the high-stakes world of luxury events, event planners sell the dream. I sell the reality. I am the invisible foundation that keeps the dream from collapsing into a massive federal lawsuit. For the past 6 months, I had been the sole architect of the foundation for Hearts Above Manhattan. It was billed as the most exclusive, high-net-worth charity gala of the decade. Hosted by the Vale Foundation, a prominent philanthropic organization, the event was designed to extract millions of dollars from Wall Street billionaires and tech moguls. The venue was a breathtaking, historic ballroom in the heart of the city, featuring vaulted ceilings, gold leaf details, and massive crystal chandeliers. The centerpiece of the entire evening was the alcohol. It wasn't just an open bar. It was an elite, curated, black tie wine and auction experience. The foundation had partnered with some of the most exclusive vineyards in the world. There were $50,000 bottles of vintage Bordeaux ready to be auctioned, and a massive, staggering champagne tower designed to flow continuously throughout the cocktail hour. I had poured my absolute soul into the compliance logistics. I spent grueling 80-hour weeks securing the temporary commercial liquor permits. I negotiated the specialized insurance riders required to serve that level of high-proof alcohol in a historic building. I vetted every single sommelier and bartender to ensure they possessed the exact municipal certifications required by law. I built a bulletproof, legally flawless event. And my boss, Richard Vale, was determined to take every single ounce of the credit. Richard was the CEO of the Vale Foundation. He was a man in his early 50s who wore bespoke Italian suits, possessed a terrifyingly aggressive smile, and loved the spotlight more than he loved oxygen. He was the kind of man who would walk past a burning building and try to take credit for the warmth. Over the course of the 6-month planning process, Richard repeatedly stood in front of the charity's board of directors and presented my logistical breakthroughs as his own visionary ideas. When I managed to secure a massive tax waiver for the international wine imports, Richard told the board it was because of a personal phone call he had made. When I spent 3 weeks renegotiating the venue's liability insurance to save the foundation $40,000, Richard proudly accepted his quarterly bonus for aggressive fiscal management. I bit my tongue. I stayed quiet. I told myself that it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as the work was excellent. I was currently a mid-level officer, but Richard had heavily implied, time and time again, that if Hearts Above Manhattan was a financial success, he would formally promote me to Director of Operations. I needed that promotion. I needed the salary bump, and I wanted the title I had already been doing the work for. So, I kept my head down and focused on the paperwork. But 3 weeks before the gala, Richard's relentless, unquenchable greed began to actively dismantle the safety of my event. I was sitting in my cramped office, reviewing the final seating chart when Richard walked in. He didn't knock. He dropped a massive, rolled-up architectural blueprint onto my desk. "I've made some adjustments to the floor plan, Claire," Richard announced, checking his expensive watch. "I need you to update the vendor manifests." I unrolled the blueprint. I stared at the new layout, feeling a cold, sharp spike of anxiety hit the back of my throat. "Richard, what is this?" I asked, looking up at him. "We have a massive waitlist for the gala." Richard smiled, clearly incredibly pleased with himself. "I told the sales team to keep pushing. We've sold an additional 15 VIP tables. At $25,000 a table, that's almost $400,000 in extra revenue." I looked back down at the paper. "You can't fit 15 more tables in the grand ballroom, Richard. The floor plan is already maximized." "I found the space," Richard said dismissively, tapping a manicured finger against the blueprint. "We're going to push the primary bar stations back against the eastern wall, and we'll line the new VIP tables along the main corridor leading out of the ballroom." "You can't do that," I said, my voice rising slightly. I grabbed a red pen and circled the eastern wall on the blueprint. "If you push the bar stations back there, you are placing the secondary liquor storage directly next to the main electrical junction boxes for the staging equipment. That is a massive fire code violation." I moved my pen and circled the main corridor. "And if you line tables along this corridor," I continued, "you are physically blocking the primary emergency egress route. The municipal fire marshal approved our maximum capacity at 450 guests. You are pushing it over 500. If you do this, Richard, you are voiding our safety permits." Richard let out a long, theatrical sigh, looking at me as if I were a particularly slow, annoying child. "Claire, please," Richard groaned, leaning against my desk. "Don't be the boring paperwork woman. We are raising millions of dollars for charity. The fire marshal isn't going to show up in the middle of a billionaire's auction with a measuring tape. Nobody cares about the technicalities." "The insurance company cares about the technicalities," I argued, pulling up my digital files. "Our specialized liquor liability rider is contingent on strict adherence to the approved floor plan. If you violate the capacity limits and block the fire exits, and someone gets hurt, the insurance won't pay out a single dime. The foundation could be sued into bankruptcy." Richard's eyes hardened. The charming CEO persona vanished, replaced by the ruthless, arrogant executive who despised being told no. "I am the CEO, Claire," Richard said, his voice dropping into a cold, dangerous register. "I am not asking for your permission. I am telling you to update the manifest. Make it work. Find a loophole. Change the font on the paperwork if you have to. But those tables are going in, and the bar is moving back." He stood up and walked toward the door. He paused, looking back over his shoulder, throwing out the bait he knew I was desperate for. "You know, the board is watching this event very closely, Claire," Richard said smoothly. "If we hit our revenue targets, that director of operations position is basically guaranteed to be yours. But I need someone in that role who solves problems, not someone who just points at the rulebook. Be a team player." He walked out of my office. I sat at my desk, staring at the ruined blueprint. I felt a sickening, heavy knot forming in my stomach. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was forcing me to choose between my professional ethics and my career advancement. He wanted me to quietly ignore the massive safety violations so he could take the credit for the record-breaking revenue, while simultaneously ensuring that if anything actually went wrong, my signature would be on the compliance forms, making me the perfect scapegoat. I didn't update the official safety manifest. I didn't forge the capacity numbers. I drafted a very polite, incredibly detailed email outlining the exact legal risks of his proposed floor plan, officially advising against the changes, and sent it to his inbox. I printed a physical copy and placed it in my compliance binder. I told myself I was just protecting myself. I told myself that once the gala was over and I got my promotion, I could implement stricter compliance protocols from a position of authority. I endured the final 3 weeks of planning in a state of quiet, agonizing tension. 2 days before the gala, we held the final technical rehearsal in the historic ballroom. The room was breathtaking. Even empty, the sheer scale of the luxury was overwhelming. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering light over the perfectly set tables. The staging was immaculate. The multi-tiered champagne tower, currently constructed with empty glasses, stood like a glass monument near the entrance. I stood in the back of the room, holding my heavy compliance binder, feeling a rare, profound sense of pride. Despite Richard's interference, I had built this. I had navigated the logistical nightmare, and it was beautiful. Richard was standing on the main stage, speaking into a wireless microphone, running through the timeline with the lighting and audio technicians. "All right, that looks fantastic." Richard's voice echoed through the massive speakers. "Lighting team, cue the spotlights on the auction tables during the dinner service. Let's make sure the billionaires can read the catalogs." He paused, looking out over the empty ballroom. His eyes landed on me, standing in the back. "Claire," Richard called out into the microphone, "come up here for a second." My heart gave a sudden, hopeful flutter. This was it. The board of directors wasn't here, but the primary vendors, the caterers, and the production team were all watching. Richard was going to acknowledge the work. He was going to publicly thank me for the 6 months of grueling, invisible labor that had made this entire evening possible. It was the absolute least he could do. I smoothed my black blazer, took a deep breath, and walked down the long center aisle toward the stage. I climbed the short set of stairs and stood next to him under the bright, warm stage lights. I looked out at the massive ballroom. It was an incredible view. "Everyone, listen up," Richard announced into the microphone, putting a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "As you know, an event of this magnitude requires absolute precision. We have 500 VIP guests arriving in 48 hours, and we need the execution to be flawless." I smiled politely, waiting for the acknowledgement. "Which is why," Richard continued, his voice booming through the room, "I am making a slight adjustment to the command structure for the evening." My smile faltered. I looked at him, confused. Richard turned toward the side of the stage and gestured grandly. "I'd like to officially introduce Chloe. She's going to be stepping in as the primary event director for the gala." A young woman, no older than 25, walked out from the wings. She was wearing a trendy, bright pink designer dress and holding an iPad. She had been hired exactly 3 weeks ago as Richard's personal administrative assistant. To my knowledge, she had never managed a single event in her life. She didn't know the difference between a fire code and a zip code. Chloe smiled brightly, waving at the production crew. "Chloe has been shadowing me closely." Richard lied effortlessly into the microphone. "She really understands my vision for the aesthetic flow of the evening. On the night of the gala, all vendor queues, timing adjustments, and floor management decisions will go directly through her." The production manager, a seasoned veteran standing near the soundboard, frowned deeply. "Mr. Vale, Claire has been our point of contact for 6 months. She holds the master timeline, and Claire has done a wonderful job with the preliminary paperwork," Richard said dismissively, squeezing my shoulder tightly, a silent warning to keep my mouth shut. "But on the night of the event, I need someone managing the floor who understands the VIP experience. Claire is going to be stationed in the back office, handling any last-minute administrative issues. Chloe is the voice of the event." He pulled his hand off my shoulder. The microphone clicked off. "Let's run the lighting cue again," Richard ordered the crew, immediately turning his back on me. I stood on the stage, completely frozen, the bright lights suddenly feeling blinding and suffocating. I looked at Chloe, who was already giggling and pointing at the champagne tower, discussing floral arrangements with the catering captain. I looked at Richard, who was admiring his own reflection in the teleprompter screen. He wasn't going to promote me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The promise of the Director of Operations title had been a lie from the very beginning. It was just a carrot dangled in front of my face to keep me working 80-hour weeks and quietly covering up his massive safety violations. He didn't just want the credit for my work. He wanted to completely erase me from the narrative. He was putting a completely unqualified 25-year-old assistant in charge of the floor so that when the billionaire donors and the board of directors arrived, they would see a young, pretty face executing his brilliant vision, while the boring, middle-aged compliance officer was locked in a windowless back office out of sight. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene on the stage. I simply turned around, walked down the stairs, and walked back up the long center aisle. I held my compliance binder tightly against my chest. Inside that binder were the approved floor plans, the municipal fire codes, the specialized liquor licenses, and the exact email where I had explicitly warned Richard Vale that his new layout was illegal and dangerous. Richard thought I was just the paperwork woman. He thought I was weak, invisible, and easily replaceable. He didn't realize that when you build the foundation of a multi-million-dollar event, you also know exactly which brick to pull to make the entire thing collapse. The humiliation on the rehearsal stage was just the beginning. The actual execution came the following morning. It was Friday, exactly 24 hours before the doors were scheduled to open for the Hearts Above Manhattan Gala. I arrived at the Foundation's corporate office at 7 o'clock in the morning, carrying a fresh cup of coffee and the final vendor checklists. Despite Richard's blatant disrespect the day before, I was still a professional. The event had to be executed safely. I sat down at my desk and opened the digital proof of the final event program. This was the glossy, high-end booklet that would be placed at the seat of every billionaire, celebrity, and board member attending the gala. I scrolled past the welcome letter, past the auction items, and stopped at the final page. The credits. The text was printed in elegant, sweeping font, the Gala concept, planning, and execution directed by Richard Vale. Event director, Chloe Davies. My name wasn't at the bottom. It wasn't in the small print. It was completely, entirely gone. I stared at the screen, my coffee turning cold on the desk. He hadn't just put Chloe in charge of the floor. He had officially and permanently erased me from the historical record of the event. The 6 months of grueling negotiations, the 60-page compliance manifest I had built from scratch, the legal battles I had fought to secure the venue. It was all credited to a man who didn't know how to read a fire code and a 25-year-old assistant who didn't know what a specialized liquor writer was. As I scrolled through the rest of the digital files, searching for where else my name had been purged, I noticed something strange in the financial ledger. There was a massive, last-minute purchase order approved directly by Richard's executive code. It was a wire transfer for $85,000, paid directly from the charity's general operating fund to a highly exclusive private wine broker in Switzerland. I pulled up the invoice. Richard had used charity money to purchase 36 bottles of incredibly rare, incredibly expensive vintage Burgundy wine. He wasn't planning to auction them. According to the catering notes, he was planning to serve them exclusively at his own VIP table to impress the wealthiest donors in the room. He was essentially buying personal loyalty using money that was supposed to go to pediatric research. It was sickening. But it was also incredibly dangerous. Importing rare vintage wines required a highly specific secondary customs and liquor declaration. A declaration that I had definitely not filed, because I didn't know the wine existed until this exact moment. My desk phone rang, startling me. "Claire," the voice of the HR director said through the receiver. "We need you in the executive conference room, right now." The tone of her voice wasn't a request. It was an order. I closed the financial ledger. I picked up my heavy compliance binder, smoothed my blazer, and walked down the long hallway toward the executive suites. When I opened the heavy glass door of the conference room, my stomach dropped. Richard Vale was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table. Next to him was the director of human resources. Standing near the door, arms crossed, was a uniformed security guard from the building's lobby. "Have a seat, Claire," Richard said. He wasn't smiling. The charming, arrogant CEO persona was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical hostility. I didn't sit down. I held my binder tightly against my chest. "What is this about, Richard?" "Claire, the foundation has decided to move in a different direction regarding our event management structure," the HR director began, reading from a prepared statement in a sterile, emotionless voice. "Effective immediately, your employment with the Vale Foundation is terminated." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air completely out of my lungs. "Terminated?" I whispered, my voice trembling despite my absolute desperation to keep it steady. "You are firing me 24 hours before the largest gala in the history of this organization?" "We feel it's the best decision for the team," Richard said smoothly, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Frankly, Claire, you've become incredibly difficult to work with. Your attitude over the last few weeks is toxic. You are inflexible, you are hostile to leadership decisions, and your obsession with rigid paperwork is actively slowing down our progress. We need an event director who is a team player, someone who can adapt. Like Chloe." He was firing me. He was actually firing me. He waited until all the hard work was done. He waited until the venue was secured, the licenses were filed, and the vendors were booked. He squeezed every single ounce of value out of my brain. And now, right before the finish line, he was discarding me so he wouldn't have to share the glory, the credit, or the promotion. "I am not inflexible, Richard," I said, my voice rising, the anger finally breaking through the shock. "I am compliant with federal and municipal law. You are pushing a floor plan that violates fire codes. You are serving undocumented vintage wine you bought with charity funds. If you let Chloe run that floor tomorrow night, you are putting 500 people at risk." And that is exactly the kind of hysterical, insubordinate behavior that led to this decision. Richard sighed, looking at the HR director and shaking his head, playing the victim perfectly. The HR director slid a thick folder across the table toward me. "This is your severance package, Claire," she said formally. "It includes 3 months of salary and extended health benefits. However, the severance is entirely contingent upon you signing the attached non-disclosure agreement. You are prohibited from discussing the internal operations of the Vale Foundation, the planning of the gala, or the circumstances of your termination with any third party, including the press." I stared at the NDA. They were buying my silence. They were handing me 3 months of pay to walk away and let Richard claim the victory without ever having to worry about me telling the board the truth. "Sign the paperwork, Claire," Richard said softly, a cruel, victorious smile finally playing on his lips. "Take the money. Go home. It's over." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had stolen 6 months of my life. For a fraction of a second, I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the mahogany table. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of him. But I was an event compliance officer. I didn't deal in emotional outbursts. I dealt in leverage. I picked up the pen. I flipped to the signature page of the NDA. And I signed my name. I didn't say a word. I took the severance check, tucked it into my blazer, and turned toward the door. "The security officer will escort you to your desk to collect your personal belongings," the HR director said. "And then he will escort you out of the building. You are not to speak to any other employees on your way out." It was the ultimate, calculated public humiliation. I walked out of the conference room with the uniformed security guard trailing closely behind me. We walked through the main open plan office. Dozens of my colleagues, people I had worked with for years, stopped typing and stared at me. Nobody said a word. The silence in the room was deafening. I felt my face burning with shame, but I kept my chin up. I packed my desk in less than 3 minutes. I took my framed photos, my favorite coffee mug, and my heavy compliance binder. Because the gala venue was located in the adjacent building, connected by a glass atrium. The quickest route to the street level was directly through the grand ballroom. "This way," the security guard mumbled, gesturing toward the atrium. We walked through the glass doors and stepped into the massive, echoing ballroom. The production crew was in the middle of their final setup. The catering teams were bustling around, polishing silverware and setting the massive tables. As I walked down the center aisle, effectively being marched out of my own event in disgrace, I didn't keep my eyes on the floor. I looked around. Without my constant supervision, Richard and Chloe had already begun executing the catastrophic layout changes I had explicitly warned them against. I looked toward the eastern wall. They had moved the primary bar stations back, exactly as Richard had demanded. And just as I had predicted, the secondary liquor storage, a massive collection of highly flammable, high-proof alcohol, was now sitting in a technical service corridor directly adjacent to an exposed, high-voltage electrical junction box used for the staging equipment. I looked at the main egress corridor, 15 additional VIP tables, heavily decorated with massive floral centerpieces, and surrounded by plush, oversized chairs, had been crammed into the space. They were physically blocking the primary emergency exit doors. If a fire broke out, 500 people would be trapped in a bottleneck of chairs and tables. Then I saw the Champagne Tower. It was breathtaking. It was a massive, 8-tiered pyramid of crystal glasses. But Chloe, prioritizing the aesthetic flow of the room, had moved it from its original, secure location near the entrance. She had placed the massive, delicate glass structure precariously close to the primary power cables running along the floor for the DJ booth. One tripped waiter, one snagged cable, and the entire tower would come crashing down onto a live electrical feed. Finally, as I passed the catering staging area, I glanced at a clipboard hanging on the wall. It was the staff roster for the evening. I stopped walking for a fraction of a second. The names of the professional, licensed sommeliers and certified bartenders I had spent weeks vetting were gone. In their place was a printed list from a cheap, third-party gig worker application. Richard had fired my highly trained staff to save money on hourly wages, replacing them with uncertified, unvetted gig workers who likely didn't possess the mandatory municipal licenses required to serve high-proof alcohol at a commercial event. "Keep moving," the security guard grunted, nudging my shoulder. I didn't argue. I started walking again. I walked out the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, through the lobby, and out onto the busy Manhattan street. The cold city air hit my face, shocking me out of the numb daze I had been walking in. I stood on the sidewalk, holding my cardboard box of personal belongings. A normal person would have gone home and cried. A normal person would have called a lawyer to complain about wrongful termination. A normal person would have felt defeated. I didn't feel defeated. I felt a terrifying absolute clarity. Richard thought he had won. He thought that by firing me, by forcing me to sign an NDA, and by publicly humiliating me in front of the entire office, he had neutralized the only person who could stop him. He thought that because I was the boring paperwork woman, I would just disappear into the shadows and let him take the glory. He didn't realize what an NDA actually covered. A non-disclosure agreement prohibits an employee from discussing confidential corporate operations or trade secrets with the press or competitors. A non-disclosure agreement does not prohibit a private citizen from reporting active, catastrophic federal safety violations to the proper governmental authorities. In fact, under municipal law, attempting to use an NDA to conceal fire code and licensing violations is a criminal offense in itself. Richard thought he was just stealing my Gala. He didn't realize he had just handed me the keys to a massive, undeniable, fully documented federal safety violation. He had forged the layout. He had blocked the fire exits. He had hired uncertified staff. He had placed highly flammable liquids next to live electrical feeds. He had purchased illegal, undeclared alcohol with charity funds. And he had done it all while arrogantly assuming that the rules didn't apply to him. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't cry. I hailed a taxi, went back to my apartment, and sat down at my dining room table. I opened my heavy compliance binder. I pulled out my laptop. I pulled up the exact municipal codes regarding commercial venue capacity. I pulled up the fire marshal regulations regarding emergency egress. I pulled up the specialized terms of the temporary event liquor license I had personally secured for the Vale Foundation. And then I pulled up the email, the exact detailed email I had sent to Richard 3 weeks ago, warning him that his new layout was illegal, dangerous, and voided our insurance. I didn't need to break into the gala to ruin Richard's night. I didn't need to cause a scene or tamper with the catering or confront him in front of the billionaires. I just needed to do my job. I opened a blank, official reporting document for the State Liquor Authority and the Municipal Fire Marshal's office. I started typing. I was the invisible foundation, and I was going to pull the brick. Drafting a formal federal compliance complaint is an incredibly sterile process. There is no room for emotion. You don't use exclamation points. You don't talk about how you feel. You just provide the raw, devastating data. I sat at my dining room table for 4 hours on Friday evening, meticulously building the report. I addressed it directly to the State Liquor Authority Enforcement Bureau, with a mandatory carbon copy to the Municipal Fire Marshal's office. I titled the email, Urgent Notification of Active Safety and Licensing Violations. Vale Foundation Charity Gala. I attached the original, legally approved floor plan. Then, I attached the digital copy of the altered blueprint Richard had unrolled on my desk, explicitly highlighting the 15 additional VIP tables, physically blocking the primary eastern egress route, pushing the venue 50 people past its legal fire capacity. I attached the email I had sent to Richard 3 weeks prior, officially warning him of the violations. I detailed the dangerous proximity of the secondary liquor storage to the high-voltage electrical junction boxes. And finally, I attached the financial wire transfer, proving the unauthorized purchase of foreign vintage wine, combined with a formal statement that the staff roster had been altered to include uncertified, third-party gig workers lacking the mandatory state licenses required to serve high-proof alcohol. I didn't ask the authorities to shut the gala down. I simply informed them that the event, as currently constructed, was operating in direct violation of the specialized event permit I had previously secured on the Foundation's behalf, thereby voiding the liability insurance rider. I hit send. Then I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of cheap red wine, and went to sleep. The gears of municipal bureaucracy usually turn incredibly slowly. But when you use the exact correct legal terminology, and when you specifically cite the voiding of a massive commercial insurance rider in a highly public historic venue, the response is immediate. The city does not want the liability of 500 billionaires burning to death because a fire exit was blocked by a floral arrangement. Saturday arrived, the night of the Hearts Above Manhattan Gala. At 6 o'clock in the evening, exactly 1 hour before the red carpet was scheduled to open, Richard Vale was standing in the center of the grand ballroom. He was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. He was adjusting his cuffs, looking proudly at the breathtaking, fully illuminated room. Chloe, the 25-year-old event director, was standing next to him, frantically tapping on her iPad, trying to figure out how to adjust the temperature of the room. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open. But it wasn't the early arrival VIPs. It was a team of 4 unsmiling men and women. 2 were wearing the dark navy windbreakers of the State Liquor Authority Enforcement Bureau. 2 were wearing the heavy tactical uniforms of the Municipal Fire Marshal's office. They carried thick clipboards and heavy-duty flashlights. They didn't stop at the check-in desk. They walked directly onto the floor of the Gala. Richard saw them immediately. His confident, arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. But he quickly recovered, smoothing his tuxedo jacket and walking toward them with his hand extended, projecting his usual aggressive charm. "Good evening, officers," Richard boomed, his voice echoing in the empty ballroom. "I'm Richard Vale, CEO of the Foundation. Is there a problem? We open our doors in 60 minutes for a highly exclusive charity event." The lead fire marshal, a stern-looking woman who looked completely unimpressed by Richard's tuxedo, did not shake his hand. "Mr. Vale, we received a highly detailed compliance report regarding multiple active safety and licensing violations at this venue," the marshal said, her voice strictly business. "We are conducting an immediate, unannounced inspection." Richard let out a short, condescending laugh. He shook his head, looking back at Chloe, as if the entire situation was an annoying joke. "I know exactly what this is," Richard said, leaning closer to the marshal, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "Officers, I apologize for wasting your time. We had to terminate a disgruntled mid-level employee yesterday for behavioral issues. She's obviously trying to cause trouble by filing a false report. I assure you, everything is perfectly up to code. My assistant here, Chloe, can show you our initial permit." Chloe nervously held up her iPad. The marshal didn't even look at it. The report included photographic evidence and internal emails confirming your intent to alter the approved floor plan, Mr. Vale. The marshal stated coldly, "We don't operate on assurances. We operate on measurements." The marshal gestured to her team. They immediately fanned out across the ballroom. Richard's arrogant smile vanished completely. For the first time all week, he looked genuinely nervous. "Now, wait a minute. You can't just tear through our setup." "Stand aside, sir," one of the SLA agents ordered sharply, moving past him toward the main bar area. For the next 30 minutes, Richard and Chloe stood helplessly in the center of the room, watching the federal and municipal authorities dismantle the illusion of their perfect event. The fire marshal walked to the eastern corridor. She pulled out a laser measuring device. She pointed it at the plush, oversized chairs of the massive VIP tables Richard had crammed into the hallway. "Primary eastern egress route is obstructed by 42 inches. The marshal called out to her partner, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. "The tables are physically blocking the push bars on the emergency doors. And the current table count indicates an occupancy of 510. That is 60 people over the legal fire limit for this specific layout." Richard scrambled over to the corridor, his face flushing red. "We can just shift the chairs. We can push them closer to the wall." "If you push them to the wall, the guests can't sit down, Mr. Vale," the marshal replied dryly. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, the two state liquor authority agents were aggressively interviewing the catering staff. "Who is the head bartender tonight?" the lead SLA agent demanded loudly. A young man in his early 20s, looking terrified in his stiff white shirt, raised his hand hesitantly. "Can I see your state-issued alcohol serving certification?" the agent asked, holding out his hand. I don't have one," the young man stammered, looking frantically at Chloe for help. "I just picked up the shift on the gig app yesterday. The app said we just had to pour wine. You are serving high-proof spirits and champagne at a commercial event with an open bar," the SLA agent said, his voice dropping into a severe, dangerous register. "Without a license. And your colleagues?" The agent looked at the line of 12 bartenders behind the main bar. Every single one of them shook their heads. Not a single person had a valid certification. Richard had fired the professionals to save money, and he had completely ignored the legal requirement for serving alcohol in the city. "Mr. Vale!" the second SLA agent shouted from the back of the room. He was standing near the technical service corridor. Richard practically sprinted over, sweating profusely in his custom tuxedo. "What is this?" the agent asked, pointing his heavy flashlight into the dark corridor. Stacked floor to ceiling were dozens of cardboard boxes containing high-proof liquor, backup champagne, and the 36 bottles of ultra-rare vintage Burgundy Richard had bought with charity funds. It's just the secondary storage, Richard stammered, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. The agent shined the flashlight 2 feet to the left. The beam illuminated a massive, exposed high-voltage electrical junction box with thick black cables running directly out to the main stage. You placed highly flammable, high-proof alcohol directly against an exposed, active high-voltage electrical panel, the agent said, turning to look at Richard with absolute disgust. Are you out of your mind? If a single bottle breaks and leaks into that panel, this entire historic building goes up in flames. We'll move it. Richard panicked, grabbing one of the boxes. Chloe, get the catering team. Move these boxes right now. Don't touch those boxes. The SLA agent barked, stepping between Richard and the alcohol. The inspection is over. The 4 officers reconvened in the center of the ballroom, standing right next to the massive, glittering champagne tower. Richard stood in front of them, breathing heavily, the sweat now visibly soaking through his collar. Chloe was visibly trembling, clutching her iPad against her chest. Mr. Vale, the fire marshal began, her face like stone. The layout violations are severe. Your VIP tables are blocking the primary exit, and you are over capacity. However, because this is a prominent charity event, and because shutting down the venue entirely would cause a massive public disruption on the street, I am going to allow the dinner service to proceed. Richard let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. Thank you. Thank you, Marshal. We'll adjust the tables immediately. I am allowing the dinner service, the Marshal clarified sharply, but the State Liquor Authority has a separate ruling. The lead SLA agent stepped forward. He did not look forgiving. Mr. Vale, you have employed uncertified staff to serve alcohol. You have placed highly flammable liquids in a dangerous, unauthorized location. And by altering the approved floor plan to an unsafe capacity, you have officially voided the specialized insurance rider required to serve alcohol at this venue. The agent pulled a heavy roll of thick, bright red tape from his pocket. The tape was printed with stark black letters, *sized, State Liquor Authority, do not remove. Your temporary event liquor permit is hereby revoked, effective immediately, the agent announced, his voice echoing in the silent ballroom. Richard's jaw dropped, the color completely drained from his face. Revoked? What do you mean, revoked? It means you cannot serve a single drop of alcohol tonight, the agent stated bluntly. He walked over to the breathtaking 8-tiered champagne tower. He ripped off a long strip of the red warning tape and slapped it directly across the front of the pristine glass structure. His partner walked behind the main bar, placing the red tape over the liquor bottles, the wine coolers, and the draft taps. No, Richard whispered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. No, you can't do this. This event is billed as a black tie wine and auction experience. I have billionaires coming in 30 minutes. The wine is the entire draw. I have international sponsors. That sounds like a marketing problem, Mr. Vale, the SLA agent replied coldly. I'll pay the fine, Richard begged, abandoning any shred of dignity, reaching for his wallet. Whatever the fine is, I'll write a check from the foundation right now. I'll hire licensed bartenders on double time. Just let me serve the wine. Please. This isn't a parking ticket, sir, the agent said, looking at Richard's wallet with absolute contempt. The permit is revoked. The alcohol is legally sealed. If my agents observe your staff serving so much as a single glass of champagne tonight, you will be arrested for violating a federal seal, and you will be escorted out of this gala in handcuffs. The agent pointed a thick finger directly at Richard's chest. Serve water, the agent ordered. The 4 officers turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Richard Vale standing in the center of the massive, beautiful room he had stolen from me. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. The production crew, the lighting technicians, and the uncertified bartenders just stared at the CEO. "Richard?" Chloe whispered, her voice shaking. "What do we do?" "The guests are going to be here in 20 minutes." Richard didn't answer her. He just stared at the bright red tape plastered across the champagne tower. He had wanted to be the visionary. He had wanted all the credit. He had mocked me for being the paperwork woman. He hadn't realized that the paperwork was the only thing standing between his fragile ego and absolute catastrophe. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy brass doors opened for the VIP reception. The guests began to arrive. These were the wealthiest people in the city. Men in custom tuxedos, women in breathtaking evening gowns, dripping in diamonds. They walked down the red carpet, expecting to be handed a flute of vintage champagne the moment they stepped into the historic venue. Instead, they were greeted by terrified gig workers, holding trays of tap water, generic sparkling water, and desperately thrown together mocktails, made from cheap cranberry juice. Richard was standing near the entrance, trying to force his arrogant smile, shaking hands with the arriving billionaires. His tuxedo was damp with nervous sweat. The first major donor to arrive was Arthur Sterling, a ruthless hedge fund manager who had purchased 3 VIP tables for $75,000. He walked into the ballroom with his wife, took a glass from a passing waiter, took a sip, and immediately grimaced. He looked at the glass, then looked at the massive, empty champagne tower covered in federal red tape. Arthur walked directly up to Richard. He didn't look happy. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the soft ambient music, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I paid 25 grand a table for a luxury wine experience. What the hell is this?" Richard swallowed hard, his arrogant smile trembling violently. "Arthur, I'm so sorry. We had a slight logistical issue with the licensings." Arthur looked at the red tape on the bar. He looked back at Richard with an expression of sheer, profound embarrassment. "Where is the champagne?" "Richard?" the billionaire asked. And in that exact moment, Richard Vale knew that his night, his career, and his entire reputation were absolutely, permanently over. A charity gala is fundamentally an exercise in controlled psychological manipulation. You ply incredibly wealthy people with incredibly expensive alcohol, lower their financial inhibitions, stroke their egos with luxury, and then ask them to open their checkbooks. If you remove the alcohol, the illusion completely shatters. The Hearts Above Manhattan Gala was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. Word of the liquor license revocation spread through the ballroom faster than a fire. By 8 o'clock, the atmosphere wasn't festive. It was hostile. The uncertified gig workers were frantically pouring generic sparkling water and desperately mixing cranberry juice and ginger ale, handing them out to Wall Street executives who had paid a small fortune expecting vintage Dom Perignon. The breathtaking champagne tower sat empty and pathetic, securely wrapped in the bright red, highly visible federal warning tape. The sponsors were the first to revolt. A representative from a massive international vineyard who had donated $40,000 worth of premium wine for the exclusive pairing menu cornered Richard near the kitchen doors. "My brand's logo is printed on every single menu in this room." "Richard," the representative yelled, not caring who heard him. "We sponsored this event for the elite exposure, and you have federal agents standing by the bars preventing a single drop of our product from being poured. Our brand is being associated with a criminal health and safety violation. We're resolving it. I promise you, we will issue a formal apology." Richard stammered, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "You're not issuing an apology. You are issuing a refund," the representative spat. "I am pulling our partnership with the foundation immediately." By the time the dinner service ended and the highly anticipated charity auction began, the room was half empty. Billionaires do not enjoy being embarrassed. and they certainly do not enjoy being sober at a party they paid heavily to attend. Without the social lubricant of the wine, the auction was a humiliating failure. Items that were supposed to generate bidding wars of $50,000 barely met their reserve prices. The wealthy donors sat in the cramped, dangerously overcrowded room, checking their watches and whispering furiously to each other about the sheer incompetence of the event management. Chloe, the 25-year-old event director, had locked herself in a bathroom stall, crying hysterically, completely unequipped to handle the furious vendors and demanding VIPs. Richard spent the entire evening hiding in the shadows, watching his career completely unravel in real time. The next morning, the disaster went public. The local society pages and a major business journal ran the story online by 9 a.m. The headline read, "Billionaire Charity Gala, Stripped of Liquor License Hours," before opening over severe fire code violations. The article detailed the blocked emergency exits, the uncertified bartenders, and the fact that federal inspectors had to seize the alcohol. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking a cup of coffee, reading the article on my tablet. I felt a deep, quiet sense of satisfaction. I hadn't destroyed the gala. Richard had destroyed the gala. I had simply turned on the lights so everyone could see it happening. At 11 a.m., my personal phone rang. It was the chairman of the board for the Vale Foundation. "Mrs. Morgan," the chairman said, his voice grave and exhausted. "We are convening an emergency executive hearing this afternoon regarding the catastrophic failure of last night's event. Richard Vale has informed the board that you intentionally sabotaged the gala as an act of retaliation for your termination. He claims you filed a completely false report." "I see," I replied calmly. "The board is requesting your presence at the hearing to respond to these allegations," the chairman said. "We need to understand exactly how this happened." "I will be there at 2 o'clock, sir," I said. I didn't dress up in a power suit. I didn't want to look like I was going to war. I wore a simple, professional gray blazer. I took my heavy compliance binder off the dining room table, and I walked out the door. The executive boardroom was tense, silent, and incredibly cold. 12 members of the board of directors sat around the massive polished table. Richard Vale was sitting at the far end. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie was loose, and the aggressive confidence was completely gone, replaced by the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered animal. When I walked into the room, Richard immediately pointed a finger at me. "There she is," Richard snarled, his voice echoing in the large room. "She's the reason we just lost $3 million in projected auction revenue. She was angry that she wasn't promoted. She became insubordinate, and when I fired her, she called the state liquor authority and lied about our floor plan just to ruin the night." The chairman held up his hand, silencing Richard. He turned to me. "Miss Morgan, you signed a non-disclosure agreement upon your termination on Friday," the chairman said carefully. "However, the board is waiving the NDA specifically for this hearing. What is your response to Mr. Vale's accusation?" I didn't yell. I didn't point my finger back at Richard. I simply walked over to the table, opened my heavy compliance binder, and began passing out neatly organized stacks of printed documents to the board members. "I did not file a false report," I said, my voice calm, steady, and incredibly loud in the quiet room. "I filed a legally mandated federal compliance notification. Mr. Vale did not fire me because I was insubordinate. He fired me because I refused to facilitate his deliberate, illegal safety violations." I tapped the first document in the stack. Document A is the original, legally approved floor plan and capacity manifest that I spent 6 months developing, I explained. Document B is the altered layout that Mr. Vale personally ordered to be implemented, adding 15 extra VIP tables. As you can see, the new layout physically blocked the primary eastern fire egress and pushed the venue 60 people over the municipal fire code limit. The board members stared at the blueprints, their expressions shifting from concern to absolute horror as they realized the massive liability they had been exposed to. Document C, I continued smoothly, is an email I sent to Mr. Vale exactly 3 weeks ago. In this email, I explicitly warn him that his new layout was illegal, highly dangerous, and would immediately void the Foundation's commercial liability insurance rider. "She's lying," Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I never saw that email. She probably typed it this morning." "Our IT department can verify the server timestamps, Mr. Vale," the chairman said coldly, not looking up from the email. I tapped the next document. "Document D is the final vendor manifest," I stated. Against my explicit, documented advice, Mr. Vale terminated our vetted, professionally licensed sommeliers to save hourly wages. He replaced them with uncertified gig workers. Serving high-proof alcohol in this city without a license is a criminal offense. I paused, letting the silence hang in the room. Then, I pulled out the final piece of paper. "And finally, Document E," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, absolute tone of finality. "This is a financial ledger showing a wire transfer of $85,000 from the Foundation's General Operating Fund, authorized by Mr. Vale's personal executive code. The funds were used to purchase 36 bottles of highly exclusive vintage Burgundy from a private broker in Switzerland." The chairman's head snapped up. $85,000? From the operating fund for wine? It was an investment in the VIP experience. Richard panicked, standing up, his voice cracking. "I was going to use it to secure larger donations. It was for the charity. The wine was never legally declared to customs, nor was it added to the temporary event liquor permit," I clarified. "It was illegal, smuggled alcohol. Mr. Vale then ordered his uncertified staff to store this highly flammable, undeclared alcohol in a technical corridor directly adjacent to an exposed, high-voltage electrical junction box used for the main stage." I closed my binder. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "I didn't ruin your gala, Richard," I said, looking directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. "I saved this foundation from a massive, multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit, a voided insurance policy, and a potential criminal investigation." I did my job. I turned to the board. "I have presented all the evidence," I said calmly. "If the board wishes to pursue legal action against me for violating my NDA to report active fire code violations, I welcome the lawsuit. My lawyer will be thrilled." I picked up my binder, turned around, and walked out of the boardroom. I didn't wait to hear the verdict. I didn't need to. The paperwork spoke for itself. The fallout was swift, absolute, and entirely merciless. Richard Vale was terminated by the board of directors before the sun went down. Because he had engaged in massive safety violations and unauthorized use of charity funds, his lucrative executive severance package was entirely voided. He left the building with nothing. The media eventually uncovered the real story. When the public realized that Richard had intentionally blocked fire exits to cram more billionaires into the room, and had used pediatric charity funds to buy vintage wine for himself, his reputation in the nonprofit sector was permanently destroyed. No reputable charity would ever hire him again. He went from being the toast of Manhattan to a complete pariah in less than 48 hours. Chloe, the 25-year-old event director, quietly resigned 2 days later and moved back to the Midwest. The foundation was forced to issue massive, humiliating public apologies. They refunded the furious sponsors and spent the next 6 months undergoing a brutal internal audit. A week after the hearing, the chairman of the board called me. He was incredibly apologetic. He offered me my job back, along with the formal title of Director of Operations and a massive salary increase. I declined. I didn't want to work for an organization that had allowed a man like Richard to operate unchecked for so long. I didn't want to rebuild a foundation that had been poisoned by that level of greed. Instead, I updated my resume, attaching the official State Liquor Authority report as a testament to my unyielding commitment to legal compliance. 3 weeks later, I was headhunted by a premium, international luxury event management firm. They didn't view compliance as an annoying obstacle. They viewed it as the ultimate luxury. They hired me as their executive director of risk and licensing, doubling the salary the foundation had offered me. 1 year later, I was standing in the back of a breathtaking historic ballroom in London. It was the opening night of a massive, multi-million-dollar international summit. The room was packed with foreign dignitaries, tech billionaires, and celebrities. The lighting was flawless. The champagne was flowing. I wasn't wearing a headset. I wasn't running around the floor panicked. I was standing quietly near the main exit, wearing a beautiful tailored evening gown, holding a heavy leather-bound compliance binder. The emergency exits were completely clear. The fire capacity was precisely maintained. Every single bartender pouring the vintage champagne held a valid, laminated municipal certification. The specialized insurance rider was perfectly active. The event was legally, structurally, and fundamentally flawless. A waiter walked by with a silver tray. I reached out and took a crystal flute. It wasn't vintage champagne. It was sparkling apple cider. I took a sip, letting the cool, crisp liquid coat my throat. I looked out over the massive, glittering ballroom. I watched the billionaires laughing, the deals being made, the absolute, intoxicating illusion of limitless luxury. People think that power in this world comes from the spotlight. They think it comes from the microphone, the custom tuxedo, or the name printed at the top of the glossy program. Richard Vale thought that because he stood on the stage, he owned the room. He was wrong. The spotlight is an illusion. The champagne is just a prop. The most powerful thing in the room was never the wine. It was the paperwork. So tell me honestly, if you spent 6 months building the perfect event, only to have your boss fire you and take all the credit, would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have pulled the brick? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.